The morning Silas Cray turned 31 years old, his oldest brother told him he was a fool and would die like one. It was October of 1856, and the hills of eastern Kentucky had begun their slow burning. Sugar maples going red and gold, hickories dropping their leaves in dry whispers along the ridgelines. Silas stood on the porch of his father's house, or what had been his father's house until 6 weeks prior, when Elijah Cray had been buried beneath the walnut tree he'd planted the year Silas was born. The tree had grown tall and straight. Silas had not grown tall, though his mother had always said he was straight in the ways that mattered. His brothers did not share her opinion. "You're getting the 40 acres past the Elk River," said Jonas, the eldest, leaning against the porch rail with a proprietary ease he'd adopted the moment their father's eyes had closed for good. He was broad-shouldered and heavy-jawed, a man who filled rooms the way furniture did, solidly, without apology. The 40 with the cave. "The cave land," Silas repeated. "That's right." Jonas didn't look at him. He was watching the hills as though they already belonged to him, which in a sense they did. Jonas had inherited the farmhouse, the cleared bottomland, the barn, and the livestock. Their middle brother, Harlan, had received the 60 acres of good timber on the south slope, along with their father's tools and the sawmill rights. Silas received what was left. Harlan stood in the doorway, arms folded. He was thinner than Jonas, but carried the same blunt certainty. "Pa wrote it that way in the will, Silas. Ain't nothing to argue about." "I'm not arguing," Silas said. "Good." Jonas spat off the side of the porch. "Because that land's worth about as much as the dirt on my boots. You can't farm it, can't timber it, nothing but scrub cedar and rock. And that cave," he shook his head. "You remember what old Dunmore said about it." Silas remembered. Everyone in the valley remembered. Thomas Dunmore had gone into the cave past the Elk River in the spring of 1843, following a draft of warm air that came from deep in the rock. He'd gone in with a lantern and a length of rope and had come out 3 hours later, white as bleached linen, refusing to say what he'd found. He sold his land within the month and moved to Lexington and never came back. When people asked him what was in the cave, he'd say only one thing: "Don't go in there." 13 years later, the warning had calcified into local legend. Children dared each other to cross the river and touch the cave mouth. Hunters gave it wide berth. The preacher at the Baptist church in Harlan's Gap had once delivered a sermon suggesting the cave was a remnant of the flood, a place where the earth hadn't fully healed, and that what lay inside was not meant for Christian eyes. Silas had always thought that was an interesting thing to say about a hole in the ground. "I'll take the 40 acres, he said quietly. Jonas laughed, a short, barking sound. "Take them and welcome. When you get tired of eating rocks, you can come work my fields. I'll pay you same as any hand." Harlan said nothing, but Silas caught the flicker of something behind his brother's eyes. Not cruelty, something worse. Pity. Silas went inside, packed his books into a canvas sack, rolled his blankets, collected the small inheritance his mother had left him, $42 in coin, and a leather-bound journal she'd kept during the years she taught school in Virginia before marrying their father. He took his knife, his father's second-best axe, a coil of rope, a tin cookpot, and a pouch of dried beans. He did not take a gun. Jonas had claimed both rifles, and Silas did not ask for one. He crossed the Elk River on foot that afternoon, the water cold around his calves. His boots hung around his neck by their laces. The sky was the color of old pewter. On the far bank, his land began, 40 acres of limestone ridges, cedar thickets, and a silence so deep it had texture. He could hear the river behind him and the wind moving through the trees ahead, and between those two sounds, nothing. The cave mouth opened in the face of a bluff about a quarter-mile from the river, partially screened by a stand of hemlock trees whose roots gripped the rock like dark fingers. The opening was wider than Silas had expected, perhaps 12 feet across and 8 feet tall, shaped like a flattened arch. The stone around it was pale gray limestone, stained with mineral seepage and long vertical streaks of rust and black. He stood before it and felt what Thomas Dunmore must have felt 13 years ago. The breath of the cave. Warm air moved outward from the darkness, steady and constant, carrying a smell that was not unpleasant. Damp stone, mineral sharpness, something faintly sweet like wet clay. In the October chill, the warmth was startling. It was like standing before an open door on a cold day, except there was no door, no house, no fire, just rock and darkness and that impossible warmth. Silas set down his pack. He lit his lantern. He did not hesitate. The entrance passage ran straight for about 30 feet, the ceiling high enough that he didn't need to duck. The walls were smooth, worn by water over millennia, and they glistened in the lantern light. The floor was dry, packed clay and gravel, easy walking. The warm air moved past him like a living current, and with each step deeper, the temperature rose. At 30 feet, the passage turned and widened. At 50 feet, it opened. Silas Cray stopped walking. He raised his lantern, and he understood in a single breath why Thomas Dunmore had been afraid. The chamber was enormous. The lantern light reached perhaps 40 feet before dissolving into darkness, but the space felt larger than that. The echoes of his breathing told him the ceiling was high, perhaps 30 feet or more. The floor was uneven, rising and falling in natural shelves and terraces. And every surface, every wall, every ledge, every stalactite hanging from the unseen ceiling was covered in crystals. They were not gemstones. Silas knew enough to recognize that immediately. They were calcite, most likely, or possibly selenite. Translucent, pale formations that caught his lantern light and threw it back in 1,000 fractured directions. Some were small, no larger than his thumbnail. Others were massive, thick columns of crystalline growth that rose from the floor like frozen pillars of milk. They clustered in formations that looked almost organic. Flowers, fans, cascading curtains of white and pale gold, and the faintest blush of pink. The effect, in the shifting lantern light, was overwhelming. The chamber seemed to pulse. Shadows moved across crystalline surfaces, creating the illusion of motion, of life. For a man who had never seen anything like it, for a man raised on Bible stories about hellfire and divine wrath, Silas could understand how this sight might look like something unholy. The crystals were beautiful, but their beauty was alien, unsettling, vast. Silas did not feel fear. He felt wonder, and immediately after a practical thought. This cave is warm. He raised his hand and held it still in the air. The temperature in the chamber was markedly warmer than outside. He guessed 60 degrees, perhaps 65. On the surface, the October air had been in the mid-40s and dropping. In another month, it would be freezing. In 2 months, snow would blanket the ridges. But here, 50 feet underground, the earth held its own heat. Silas had read about this in one of his books, a volume on natural philosophy that his mother had given him when he was 14. The earth maintained a constant temperature below a certain depth, regulated by forces that had nothing to do with the weather above. He could live here. The thought arrived with the force of revelation. though it was born of practicality. He had no house. He had no money to build one. He had 40 acres of land that his own brothers considered worthless, and a cave that the entire valley believed was cursed. But the cave was warm. The cave was dry. The cave was enormous, with natural chambers that could serve as rooms, natural shelves that could hold his belongings, and a constant temperature that would require no firewood to maintain through the coldest Kentucky winter. Silas Cray sat down on a ledge of crystalline limestone and ate a handful of dried beans from his pouch. He opened his mother's journal and, on the first blank page, began to write. October 14th, 1856. Have entered the cave. It is not what they said. There are crystals everywhere, calcite, I believe, and the temperature is warm, perhaps 62 or 63 degrees. I can hear water deeper in. The air is good. I will stay. He spent the first week exploring. The cave system was far more extensive than the single chamber suggested. Beyond the main room, which Silas came to call the Crystal Hall, a series of narrower passages branched in 3 directions. The northern passage descended sharply and led to an underground stream. Cold, clear water that tasted of minerals and ran over a bed of smooth stones. The southern passage climbed slightly and opened into a smaller chamber with a low ceiling and a floor of packed red clay. The western passage was the longest, winding deeper into the limestone ridge for what Silas estimated was nearly 200 feet before terminating in a wall of flowstone, a solid curtain of mineral deposit that water had laid down over thousands of years, smooth as polished marble and faintly translucent. Each passage had its own character. The northern one was cooler and damper, the sound of running water constant. The southern chamber was the warmest. Silas measured it as best he could against his own body, and guessed it held steady near 65 degrees, perhaps warmer. The western passage maintained a temperature somewhere between the two. By the end of his first week, Silas had established a routine. He slept in the southern chamber, where the warmth was greatest, on a bed of cedar boughs he'd cut from the trees outside. He stored his food and supplies in the crystal hall, using the natural shelves as a pantry. He drew water from the underground stream. He kept his lantern burning only when necessary, to conserve oil, and spent his evenings writing in his mother's journal by the glow of a small tallow candle. The darkness at first was the hardest thing. Not the darkness of night, which every person knows, but the absolute darkness of deep stone, a blackness so complete that there was no difference between having your eyes open and having them shut. When Silas extinguished his candle, the world disappeared entirely. He could hear his own heartbeat, his own breathing, the distant murmur of the underground stream. But he could see nothing, not his hand in front of his face, not the walls that surrounded him. Nothing. He learned to endure it, and then to accept it, and then, gradually, to find comfort in it. The darkness was not hostile. It was simply absolute, and in its absoluteness there was a kind of peace. No distractions, no judgments, no brothers looking at him with contempt or pity, just the warm stone and the darkness and his own thoughts. During the days, he worked. His first project was the entrance. The cave mouth was wide and open, which meant that cold air could penetrate the first 30 feet of the passage, and that rain could reach even farther. Silas needed a barrier, something that would keep the weather out while allowing him to pass freely. He felled cedar trees from the slope above the bluff and split them into rough planks using his axe and a series of wooden wedges he carved from hickory. It was slow work. The cedar was aromatic and straight-grained but hard, and without a proper saw, each plank took hours. Over the course of 2 weeks, he built a wall across the cave entrance. Not a solid wall, but a fitted framework of cedar planks, with a door he hung on leather hinges cut from his own belt. He left gaps at the top for ventilation, knowing from his reading that caves needed to breathe, that blocking the airflow entirely would change the temperature and the air quality in ways he couldn't predict. The wall transformed the cave. With the entrance sealed against wind and rain, the interior temperature stabilized. Silas measured it obsessively, marking his estimates in the journal each morning and evening. The crystal hall held steady between 58 and 62 degrees. The southern chamber, his sleeping quarters, stayed near 65. On the first night of November, when frost whitened the ground outside and the temperature dropped below 30, Silas sat in his chamber in his shirt sleeves and felt warm. He wrote in the journal, November 3rd, 1856, "It is below freezing outside. In the southern chamber, it is 64 degrees. I am warm without fire. The earth is my furnace." Word traveled, as it does in small places. A hunter named Cobb passed by the cave in late November and saw the cedar wall and the chimney of smoke from the small fire Silas sometimes lit in the crystal hall for cooking. Cobb told the men at the general store in Harlan's Gap that Elijah Cray's youngest had moved into the cave past the Elk River. The news spread with the speed of gossip and the embellishment of fear. They said he'd gone mad with grief over his father's death. They said he was living like an animal. They said he'd gone into the cave and the cave had taken him, the way it had taken Thomas Dunmore's nerve. The preacher mentioned him in a sermon, not by name, but clearly enough. A parable about a man who sought shelter in dark places and found only his own damnation. Silas heard the talk when he came to the store for supplies: salt, flour, lamp oil, a new axe handle. The storekeeper, a man named Birch, was polite but careful, the way people are careful around those they suspect of instability. "Staying warm up there?" Birch asked, wrapping the salt in brown paper. "Warmer than most," Silas said. "Caves got a reputation." "Caves don't have reputations. People do." Birch considered this. "Dunmore said—" "I know what Dunmore said. He saw crystals in the dark and thought he saw the devil." Silas counted out his coins. "The cave is limestone and calcite. It's warm because the earth is warm at depth. There's nothing in there but rock and water and good air." "If you say so." "I do." Silas took his supplies and left. He did not care what they thought. He had warmth, shelter, water, and solitude. He had his books and his journal. He had work to do, and there was, in truth, so much work. Through December and January, the coldest months, Silas expanded his living space. He cleared the southern chamber of loose stone and leveled the floor with packed clay from the deeper passages. He built a sleeping platform from cedar planks, raising it a foot off the floor to avoid the slight dampness that crept along the stone. He fashioned shelves into the natural alcoves of the crystal hall and organized his meager possessions with the precision of a man who understood that order was a form of warmth. He built a fire pit near the cave entrance, beneath the ventilation gaps in his cedar wall, and learned through trial and careful observation how to manage the draft so that smoke escaped upward through the gaps while heat radiated inward. The fire was for cooking only. He did not need it for warmth. The cave provided that. But hot food was a comfort he was unwilling to surrender. The winter of 1856 to 57 was brutal. Snow fell in December and did not fully melt until March. The river froze in places, thick enough in January that a man could walk across it, and the silence of the frozen valley was so complete that Silas could hear tree branches cracking under the weight of ice half a mile away. Game grew scarce. The deer moved to lower ground, and the wild turkeys vanished entirely for weeks at a stretch. Silas ate sparingly, beans, cornmeal, dried venison he'd traded for at Birch's store. He supplemented with hickory nuts he'd gathered in the fall and stored in a natural alcove near the cave entrance, and with watercress he found growing in the shallows of the underground stream, a discovery that startled him until he read in one of his books that certain plants could survive in cave environments where groundwater carried sufficient nutrients. He lost weight. His clothes hung loose. His hands roughened and cracked from the cold air outside and the constant work of splitting wood and hauling water. Some mornings, he woke in the darkness of the southern chamber and felt the weight of his isolation like a physical thing, the knowledge that no one in the world knew or cared whether he was alive or dead, that if he fell and broke his leg in the deeper passages, he would lie there until he didn't lie anywhere anymore. But he was never cold, and that fact, that single stubborn fact, sustained him through the worst of it. When the wind howled across the ridgeline above and the temperature outside dropped to 0, Silas sat in his chamber at 64 degrees and read by candlelight, and the warmth of the stone around him was like the warmth of a promise kept. He taught himself to trap that winter, small game mostly, rabbits and possums, using snares fashioned from bark fiber and later from wire he bought at Birch's store. He learned which roots could be eaten raw and which needed boiling. He learned to read the weather by the cave's behavior. When the draft from the entrance strengthened, a storm was coming. When the air grew particularly still, the cold had deepened to the point where the temperature differential between inside and outside was at its greatest. The cave was not just his home, it was his teacher. That fact alone was remarkable enough to draw attention. In February, a man named Dr. Aldous Pennington rode up from Frankfurt. He was a geologist, one of the survey team that the state had commissioned to map Kentucky's mineral resources. He'd heard about the cave from a colleague who'd heard about it from a politician, who'd heard about it from a preacher, who'd heard about it from a hunter, who'd heard about it from Cobb. By the time the story reached Pennington, it had mutated from a tale of madness into something that piqued his professional curiosity. A cave with crystals large enough to be mistaken for supernatural phenomena, and a man living inside it who claimed the temperature never dropped below 60 degrees. Pennington arrived on a gray February morning, his horse picking its way across the frozen river. He was a small, precise man in his 50s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a leather case full of instruments. Silas met him at the cave entrance. "You're Cray?" Pennington said, dismounting. "I am. I'm told you're living in a crystal cave and staying warm without fire." "Without fire for heat," Silas corrected. "I cook with fire." "May I see?" Silas opened his cedar door and led the geologist inside. Pennington's reaction to the crystal hall was everything Thomas Dunmore's had not been. Where Dunmore had seen terror, Pennington saw treasure. Not monetary treasure, though that would come, but scientific treasure. He spent 3 hours in the cave, measuring temperatures with a mercury thermometer, chipping small samples from the crystal formations, sketching the chamber dimensions in a leather notebook, and asking Silas questions with the intensity of a man who has found exactly what he's been looking for. "The crystals are calcite," Pennington confirmed, holding a sample up to his lantern. "Dogtooth spar, primarily. Some of the larger formations may include celestine, strontium sulfate. That would account for the blue tint in certain clusters." He turned to Silas. "Do you know what you have here?" "Crystals," Silas said. "You have one of the most remarkable mineral formations I've ever seen in the state of Kentucky, possibly in the entire Appalachian region." Pennington's spectacles caught the lantern light. These formations took tens of thousands of years to develop. The conditions required, the precise mineral content of the water, the temperature stability, the rate of evaporation, it's extraordinary. And the warmth? Pennington nodded. Geothermal regulation. You're deep enough in the limestone that the surrounding rock mass maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round. The Earth at this depth stays between 55 and 65 degrees regardless of surface conditions. The cave acts as a thermal buffer, warm in winter, cool in summer. It's the same principle that keeps deep wells at a constant temperature. I read about that, Silas said. Pennington looked at him with new interest. You read? I read everything I can find. Then you should read Lyell and Agassiz. And if you can find a copy, James Dwight Dana's Manual of Mineralogy. What you have here, Mr. Cray, is not a cursed hole in the ground. It's a natural laboratory. Pennington left that evening with a saddlebag full of crystal samples and a promise to return in the spring with proper survey equipment. He also left Silas with something more valuable than any crystal: the knowledge that what he'd found was real, was significant, and was his. That night, Silas wrote in the journal, February 22nd, 1857. A geologist came. He says the crystals are calcite and celestine. He says the cave is remarkable. He says I should read Dana. He called it a natural laboratory. I think he is right. I think there is more to find. There was. There was so much more. Spring came to the Kentucky hills like a slow exhale. The snow thinning, the river swelling with meltwater, the trees budding in that tentative way they have, as though unsure winter has truly finished with them. Silas emerged from the cave into the March sunlight with the feeling of a man surfacing from a deep dive. He had survived the winter. He had more than survived it. He had been comfortable. The irony was not lost on him. His brother Jonas, in the farmhouse with its stone fireplace and woodpile, had burned through 3 cords of wood during the winter months. Harlan, in the timber cabin he'd built on the south slope, had burned through nearly as much. Silas had used perhaps a 1/4 cord, and only for cooking. The cave had provided what their houses could not: effortless, constant warmth, generated by the earth itself, requiring no labor, no fuel, no expense. He spent the spring improving his homestead. Above the cave, on the flat top of the limestone bluff, he cleared a small garden plot, barely a 1/4 acre, and planted beans, corn, squash, and potatoes. The soil was thin, but surprisingly fertile, enriched by centuries of leaf fall from the surrounding forest. He built a small smokehouse from stacked limestone slabs and began curing venison and wild turkey. He constructed a crude but effective rain collection system using cedar troughs and a barrel, supplementing the underground stream water with surface water for his garden. Pennington returned in April, as promised, bringing 2 colleagues from the State Survey and a mule loaded with equipment. They spent 4 days mapping the cave system, taking measurements, and cataloging the crystal formations. Their report, filed with the Kentucky Geological Survey that summer, would describe the cave as a significant mineral formation of considerable scientific interest, noting the unusual size and variety of the calcite and celestine crystals and the remarkably stable thermal environment. But it was Pennington who gave Silas the idea that would change his fortunes. The celestine, Pennington said on his last evening, sitting with Silas outside the cave entrance as the sunset turned the hills to copper. It's valuable. How valuable? Strontium compounds are used in sugar refining. Strontium hydroxide separates sugar from molasses. The process was patented a few years ago in Germany, and demand for strontium ore is growing. Celestine is one of the primary sources. Pennington sipped the coffee Silas had brewed over his cooking fire. You have veins of it throughout the deeper passages. If you could extract it carefully, without destroying the larger formations, you could sell it. How much? Difficult to say, but strontium ore has been selling for $12 to $15 per ton in eastern markets. From what I've seen, you may have several hundred tons accessible without deep mining. Silas did the arithmetic in his head. Even at the low end, the numbers were significant. Not a fortune, but enough to live on. Enough to build on. There's also the specimens, Pennington added. The crystal clusters. Museums and private collectors pay well for quality mineral specimens. Some of your dog-tooth spar formations are museum grade. That summer, Silas began his careful extraction. He worked slowly, deliberately, with a respect for the cave that bordered on reverence. He would not blast. He would not use heavy tools. He had seen what careless mining did. He had read about cave systems in Virginia and Tennessee that had been gutted by men interested only in what they could pull out and sell, leaving behind rubble and ruin where thousands of years of geological artistry had once stood. He would not do that to his cave. He chiseled and pried and coaxed the celestine from the rock the way a surgeon removes a tumor, preserving as much of the surrounding structure as possible, taking only what the cave could afford to give. He developed a technique over those first weeks that he would refine for years afterward. Using a series of thin iron chisels and a light hammer, he would trace the natural boundaries of a celestine vein, following the seams where the mineral had deposited between layers of limestone. He learned to feel the difference in the stone through the chisel, the subtle shift in vibration when the tool passed from limestone to celestine, from crystal to clay. He learned to read the color gradations in the rock by lantern light, identifying the pale blue-white of the celestine against the warmer gray of the surrounding limestone. Each extraction took hours, some took days, but the result was clean, intact mineral that fetched premium prices because it arrived undamaged and properly separated. He hired a boy from the valley to help him haul the ore to the river, where it could be loaded onto flatboats headed for the processing plants downriver. The boy, a 14-year-old named Josiah Meeks, was the son of a widow who lived in a shack near Harlan's Gap. He was strong and quiet and willing to work for $1 a week, and he asked no questions about the cave that he didn't need answered. Josiah had never been inside a cave before, and on his first visit to the Crystal Hall, he stood motionless for a full minute, his mouth slightly open, the way a person stands when the world has suddenly become larger than they thought it was. "It ain't cursed," Josiah said finally. "No," Silas agreed. "It's not. It's the prettiest thing I ever saw." Silas nodded. He thought it might be the truest thing anyone had said about the cave yet. The first shipment, 2 tons of celestine ore, brought $28 from a buyer in Cincinnati. The second shipment, a month later, brought $31. By the end of the summer, Silas had earned over $150 from ore sales alone, plus another $40 from mineral specimens he'd sold through Pennington's contacts at the State University. For a man who'd arrived at the cave with $42 and a sack of beans, it was a transformation. Silas did not spend lavishly. He spent wisely. He bought tools, a proper crosscut saw, a set of chisels, a hand drill, a spirit level. He bought books, Dana's Manual of Mineralogy, as Pennington had recommended, along with Lyell's Principles of Geology, and a used copy of Silliman's Journal of Science that contained articles on cave formation and groundwater chemistry. He bought better provisions, cured ham, coffee, sugar, dried fruit. He bought fabric and paid a seamstress in Harlan's Gap to make him 2 new shirts and a heavy wool coat. He invested the rest in the cave itself. Through the autumn of 1857 and the following winter, Silas rebuilt his living space with the care and precision of a craftsman who understands that his home is also his livelihood. He replaced the rough cedar plank wall at the entrance with a proper fitted timber frame, mortised and pegged, with a solid oak door on iron hinges he'd ordered from a blacksmith in Richmond. He installed a wood stove, a small cast-iron model from a foundry in Pennsylvania, vented through a stone chimney he built up through a natural fissure in the rock. The stove was for cooking and for the comfort of visible flame. The cave still provided all the heat he needed. He smoothed the floors of his living chambers with layers of packed clay and flat stone. He built furniture, a bed frame, a table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf, from black walnut he harvested from the bottomland near the river. The walnut was difficult to work, but beautiful, with grain that seemed to hold light, and Silas discovered in himself a talent for joinery that he hadn't known he possessed. Each piece was simple but precise, the joints tight, the surfaces smooth. He built a second room, a workshop and study, in an alcove off the Crystal Hall, where natural light penetrated through a narrow chimney in the rock during midday hours. He set up his mineral samples on shelves, organized by type and location within the cave, labeled in his careful handwriting. He pinned Pennington's geological maps to the wall. He built a desk from walnut and sat at it each evening, reading and writing by lantern light, adding to the growing body of observations in his mother's journal. The journal had become something more than a diary. It was becoming a scientific record. Silas noted temperatures twice daily, tracked the underground stream's water level, documented new crystal formations he discovered as he carefully extended his extraction tunnels, recorded the species of bats that roosted in the deeper chambers and the patterns of their seasonal movement. He drew detailed sketches of crystal structures, copying the illustrative style from Dana's manual. He was not a trained scientist, but he was methodical and honest, and his observations were precise. It was the journal, ultimately, that brought him to the attention of Margaret Sills. Margaret was 27 years old in the spring of 1858, the daughter of a Welsh mining engineer who had emigrated to Pennsylvania in 1840 and died in a coal mine collapse in 1852. Her mother had moved the family, Margaret and 2 younger brothers, to Kentucky, where a distant cousin offered them a house in Lexington. Margaret had been educated in Pennsylvania's public schools and had continued her studies informally, reading voraciously and attending public lectures at Transylvania University whenever they were open to women, which was not often. She was not beautiful in the way that magazines prescribed beauty. She was tall, angular, with dark hair she wore, pulled back severely, and eyes that were the precise gray-green of river water. Her hands were strong. She'd worked alongside her father in his workshop as a child, and she could identify minerals by sight and touch with an accuracy that surprised men twice her age. She had no dowry, no connections, and no interest in the social performances that constituted courtship in Lexington society. She had come to eastern Kentucky to collect mineral samples for a professor at Transylvania who was assembling a teaching collection. Pennington had mentioned the cave in a letter to the professor, and the professor had mentioned it to Margaret, and Margaret had made the 2-day journey from Lexington on horseback, alone, which was precisely the sort of thing that Margaret Sills did, and that polite society found unforgivable. She arrived at the cave on a Tuesday in late April, as Silas was splitting wood outside the entrance. He looked up and saw a woman on a dun horse, sitting straight-backed in a riding habit that was practical rather than fashionable, with a geologist's hammer hanging from her saddle and a leather specimen bag across her shoulder. "Mr. Cray?" she said. "Yes." "My name is Margaret Sills. Dr. Pennington suggested I visit your cave." It's not my cave, Silas said. I just live in it. A fine distinction. She dismounted. May I see it? He led her inside. Unlike Pennington, who had been methodical but excitable, Margaret moved through the crystal hall with a focused quiet that Silas recognized because it matched his own. She examined the formations without touching them, bending close, angling her lantern to catch the light at different facets. She identified the calcite, the celestine, and, to Silas's surprise, a vein of pale blue barite he hadn't noticed in a shadowed recess near the flowstone wall. Barite, she said, chipping a small sample with her hammer. Barium sulfate. It's used in paint manufacturing and as a weighting agent in oil drilling. This is a clean vein, high quality. I missed it, Silas admitted. You weren't looking for it. She straightened. You've been focused on the celestine. Understandably, it's more immediately valuable. But the barite may be worth more in the long term. Demand is growing as the petroleum industry expands. They talked for 3 hours. It was the longest conversation Silas had had with anyone since his father's death. Margaret asked about his extraction methods, his temperature records, his observations of the bat colonies. She read portions of his journal with a seriousness that made his chest tighten. She corrected 2 of his mineral identifications and confirmed a dozen others. She told him about her father's work in the Welsh mines, about strontianite deposits in Scotland, about the crystallography lectures she'd attended in Lexington. Silas listened. He had spent 18 months listening to the silence of the cave, to the drip of water and the breathing of stone. Listening to Margaret Sills was like hearing a language he'd forgotten he knew. She stayed 3 days, sleeping in a tent she'd brought, working alongside Silas in the cave during the days. On the second evening, sitting outside the entrance as the whippoorwills began their calling, she asked him why he'd come to live in a cave. Silas told her about his father's death, the inheritance, his brother's mockery, about Thomas Dunmore and the town's fear, about the first night in the darkness when he'd extinguished his candle and felt the warm stone around him like a hand. They were afraid of beauty, Margaret said. That's what Dunmore saw. Beauty he couldn't explain. And people are always afraid of what they can't explain. I wasn't afraid, Silas said. No. She looked at him. You were curious. That's the difference between a man who runs and a man who stays. She left on the 3rd day with her specimen bag full of samples and a promise to send him copies of journals from the university library. She kept the promise. Over the following months, a steady stream of packages arrived at Birch's store for Silas. Scientific journals, geological surveys, and letters in Margaret's precise handwriting discussing mineral formations, extraction techniques, and market conditions for strontium and barium compounds. The letters grew longer. They grew warmer. By autumn, they contained passages that had nothing to do with mineralogy. Observations about the changing light in Lexington, memories of her father, questions about the color of the hills above Silas's cave in October. Silas answered every letter the day he received it. He was not skilled at expressing emotion on paper, but he was honest, and honesty, in Margaret's estimation, was worth more than eloquence. He proposed in a letter dated January 12th, 1859. She accepted in a letter dated January 20th. They were married in Harlan's Gap on March 3rd, 1859, in a ceremony attended by the storekeeper Birch, young Josiah Meeks, and a handful of valley residents who came partly out of goodwill and partly out of curiosity to see the woman willing to marry the caveman. Jonas and Harlan did not attend. Margaret moved into the cave and immediately began improving it with the practical energy of a woman who had grown up in mining country and understood what living underground required. She insisted on better ventilation. A second air shaft chiseled through the rock above the southern chamber, fitted with a cedar cap that could be opened and closed to regulate airflow. She redesigned the cooking area, building a proper stone hearth with a reflector wall that directed heat more efficiently. She brought curtains from Lexington, heavy wool in deep red, and hung them across the passage openings to create distinct rooms with a sense of privacy and warmth. She brought books, dozens of books. The walnut bookshelf Silas had built was insufficient within months, and he built 3 more. Their collection grew to include geology, chemistry, botany, history, poetry, and a complete set of Shakespeare that Margaret had inherited from her father. The cave, which had been austere and functional under Silas's sole care, became under their joint stewardship something that visitors would later describe as astonishing. A home of genuine comfort and surprising beauty carved into the living rock, lit by lanterns whose light fractured through crystal formations into prismatic displays that no chandelier could match. The mineral business grew steadily. With Margaret's knowledge of markets and her contacts at the university, they expanded beyond raw ore sales. They began preparing mineral specimens for collectors and institutions, carefully extracted, cleaned, mounted on wooden bases, labeled with precise geological descriptions. These specimens sold for $5 to $20 each, depending on quality and size, and the demand seemed inexhaustible. Museums in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston placed standing orders. A private collector in London purchased a particularly fine Celestine cluster for $75, more than many Kentucky farmers earned in a year. By 1861, when the Civil War began to tear the nation apart, Silas and Margaret had saved over $2,000. They were, by any reasonable measure, prosperous. The cave that Jonas had dismissed as worthless was generating more income than his bottomland farm. The war touched them lightly, though not without consequence. Kentucky's neutrality held for a time, and eastern Kentucky's remote valleys saw little direct conflict in the early years. Silas was 36 when Fort Sumter fell, too old for the initial call to arms and too essential to his small enterprise to be missed. But the war came close enough to feel. Confederate and Union forces skirmished along the mountain passes to the south, and twice during 1862, foraging parties passed through the Elk River Valley, taking livestock and grain from the farms below. They did not climb to the cave. Perhaps they didn't know it was there. Perhaps, Silas thought, the old superstition served as a kind of shield. Even soldiers hesitated to enter a place the locals called cursed. He supplied strontium compounds to a federal munitions buyer. Strontium nitrate was used in signal flares and tracer rounds, and the war, grim as it was, proved profitable for the cave's mineral output. Margaret handled the correspondence and the contracts with a businesswoman's precision, negotiating prices that reflected the growing scarcity of the compounds as other suppliers were disrupted by the conflict. She kept meticulous accounts in a separate ledger, and by war's end, the munitions contracts alone had brought in over $800. The war also brought loss to the valley. Josiah Meeks, the boy who had hauled Silas's first ore to the river, enlisted in the Union Army at 18 and was killed at the Battle of Perryville in October of 1862. When Silas heard the news, he walked to the deepest chamber of the cave and sat in the darkness for an hour, thinking about a boy who had been strong and quiet and willing to work for $1 a week, and who had deserved a better ending than a bullet in a cornfield 100 miles from home. He carved Josiah's name into the flowstone wall of the western passage, a small memorial in a place where time moved slowly enough that the letters might last 1,000 years. Their first child, a son named Elijah after Silas's father, was born in the cave in November of 1860, before the war had fully begun. Margaret delivered him in the southern chamber, in the steady 65-degree warmth, attended by a midwife from the valley who had never been inside the cave and who spent the first 20 minutes of her visit staring at the crystal formations with her mouth open. The child was healthy and loud, and his cries echoed through the crystal hall in a way that made Silas stand very still and close his eyes, because the sound of a child's voice in a place of ancient stone was something he had not known he needed to hear. A daughter, Clara, followed in 1862, born during a thunderstorm that shook the hills above while the cave remained perfectly still and warm below. A second son, Thomas, named, in a quiet act of grace, after Thomas Dunmore, came in 1865, the year the war ended. Margaret said it was fitting. A new life at the close of so much death, a beginning where there had been too many endings. The children grew up in the cave and on the land above it. They played among the crystal formations, learned to identify minerals before they learned to read, and considered the underground stream a perfectly normal place to bathe. They had no idea in their early years that their home was unusual. It was simply where they lived, a warm place of stone and light, and their parents' voices echoing softly through the passages. Only later, when they went to the schoolhouse in Harlan's Gap and the other children asked them questions, did they really live underground? Wasn't it dark? Weren't they scared? Did they begin to understand that most people found caves frightening rather than comforting? Elijah, the eldest, inherited his father's quiet observation and his mother's analytical mind. He was a serious boy who kept his own journal from the age of 8, recording the weather and the water levels and the number of bats he counted in the roosting chamber each evening. Clara was bold and physical, climbing the bluff face and exploring passages of the cave system that even Silas hadn't fully mapped. She once disappeared for 6 hours into a narrow side passage that Silas had marked as too tight for an adult, and returned covered in red clay and carrying a geode the size of her fist, split open to reveal a hollow lined with amethyst crystals, the only amethyst ever found in the cave system. Margaret cleaned it and set it on the mantel of the hearth, where it caught the firelight and threw purple shadows across the stone walls. Young Thomas was gentle and bookish, happiest with a lantern and a specimen bag in the deeper chambers, cataloging formations with the meticulous care of a born naturalist. He had his mother's gray-green eyes and a way of looking at crystals as though they were speaking to him in a language only he could hear. Margaret taught all 3 children to read and write and do sums, using the cave itself as a classroom. Geology lessons among the formations, arithmetic problems based on ore shipments and specimen sales, reading by lantern light in the crystal hall while the crystals threw their fractured light across the pages like illustrations drawn by the earth itself. The decades turned. Silas entered middle age and then old age with the unhurried steadiness of a man whose life was built on stone. The cave operation evolved. By the 1870s, the Celestine extraction had slowed as the most accessible veins were worked out, but the specimen business thrived. Margaret, who had become a respected figure in Kentucky's small but growing scientific community, published a monograph on the cave's crystal formations in 1873 that was cited in geological surveys for decades afterward. Visitors began arriving, scientists, collectors, and eventually tourists, drawn by the growing reputation of what the newspapers had begun calling Cray's Crystal Cave. Silas built guest quarters above the cave entrance, a modest but comfortable cabin with a stone fireplace and a porch overlooking the Elk River Valley. He charged visitors 50 cents for a guided tour of the cave and $1 for an overnight stay. The income was modest but steady, and it gave Silas an audience for the knowledge he'd accumulated over 2 decades of living underground. He became a teacher, though he never would have used the word. He led visitors through the crystal hall, explaining the geology in plain, clear language that made the science accessible without diminishing its wonder. He showed them the temperature records he'd kept for 20 years, meticulous data that demonstrated the cave's thermal stability through every season. He told them about geothermal regulation, about the slow growth of crystals, about the underground watershed that connected his cave to springs miles away. He spoke about the earth the way some men spoke about God, with reverence, with wonder, and with the conviction that understanding something deeply only made it more miraculous, not less. Jonas died in 1878. He had overworked the bottomland, planted the same crops year after year without rotation, and the soil had given out. He'd mortgaged the farm to buy new equipment, then mortgaged it again when the crops failed. When he died of pneumonia at 58, the bank took the farmhouse and the cleared acres, and his wife moved to her sister's home in Virginia. He had never visited the cave. He had never spoken to Silas again after the day of the inheritance. Harlan lasted longer. He had managed the timber wisely enough to maintain a living, but a sawmill accident in 1871 cost him 3 fingers on his left hand and most of his ability to work. He came to the cave once in the autumn of 1875, a diminished, gray-haired man who stood in the crystal hall and said nothing for a long time. "Pa should have given this to you straight out," Harlan finally said. "He knew. He always knew you were the one who'd see what it was." "He gave it to me," Silas said. "That was enough." Harlan nodded. He left and did not come back, but he sent his son, Silas's nephew, a boy named William, to work in the cave during the summers. Silas taught him mineralogy, the way Margaret had taught him, and the boy carried those lessons into a career as a mining engineer in Colorado. In the cave, time moved differently. Above ground, the world was accelerating. Railroads, telegraphs, electric light, the frenzy of the Gilded Age. Below ground, the crystals grew at their imperceptible pace. The underground stream ran its eternal course, and the temperature held steady at 63 degrees, as it had held for millennia before Silas arrived, and would hold for millennia after he was gone. He understood this. It gave him peace. Margaret died in February of 1889 of a fever that came on quickly and burned through her with a cruelty that the cave's steady warmth could not counter. She was 58. The illness took 3 days. 3 days during which Silas did not leave her side, did not eat, did not record the temperature in his journal for the first time in 33 years. He held her hand in the southern chamber as she went, and when it was over, he sat beside her in the darkness for a long time, listening to the cave breathe around him. That soft, constant movement of air that he had known for 33 years, and that sounded, in that moment, like grief given physical form. He buried her above the cave, on the bluff top, beside the garden she had tended for 3 decades. He dug the grave himself, though Thomas offered to do it, because there were certain acts of love that could not be delegated. The ground was hard with February frost, and it took him most of a day, and when he was finished, his hands were blistered and bleeding, and he felt something that he had not felt since the first winter in the cave. Truly cold. He planted a dogwood tree at the head of her grave, because she had loved the way dogwoods bloomed in April, white against the dark hillsides, like scattered pages from a book. He resumed the journal the next morning. He recorded the temperature, 64 degrees in the southern chamber, and added a single line. Margaret is gone. The cave feels larger. After her death, Silas slowed. He continued his tours, his observations, his teaching, but the evenings were long, and the silence of the cave, which had once been his companion, now held an emptiness that no crystal's refracted light could fill. He found himself talking to her sometimes, in the quiet of the crystal hall, telling her about the day's visitors, a new formation he'd noticed in the western passage, a letter from Elijah. He did not believe she could hear him. He spoke because the sound of her name in the cave was better than the sound of nothing. He took to walking the ridgeline above the cave at sunset, something he had rarely done in the busy years of the business and the children's upbringing. From the bluff top, he could see the Elk River winding through the valley below, the patchwork of farms and woodlots, the smoke from chimneys in Harlan's Gap. The world he had left behind 40 years ago, and which had continued without him, changing in ways both visible and invisible. The railroad had come through in 1882, bringing with it a bustle of commerce and noise that seemed to Silas to belong to a different century than the one he inhabited. Telegraph wires crossed the hills. There was talk of electric light coming to the larger towns. The world was accelerating, hurtling toward something Silas could sense but not quite name. Below him, the cave waited, patient, unchanged, the crystals growing at their imperceptible pace, the underground stream running its eternal course, the temperature holding steady at 63 degrees, as it had held for millennia before Silas arrived, and would hold for millennia after he was gone. He understood this. It gave him peace. His children were grown and scattered. Elijah had become a professor of geology at the University of Kentucky, the first in the family to hold a formal academic post, and he visited the cave each summer with his own children, who regarded their grandfather's underground home with the same mixture of wonder and normalcy that Elijah himself had felt as a boy. He brought his students sometimes too, and Silas would lead them through the crystal hall, explaining the formations with the patient clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime looking. The students called him Professor Cray, and he corrected them gently. He was not a professor. He was just a man who lived in a cave and paid attention. Clara had married a doctor in Louisville and raised 5 children, all of whom spent summers at the cave and grew up with limestone dust in their pockets and crystal fragments in their memory. She wrote to her father weekly, long letters full of city life and children's ailments, and a persistent undertone of longing for the quiet of the hills. Thomas, the youngest, had stayed closest. He lived in the cabin above the cave and managed the specimen business, corresponding with collectors and museums across the country, with the same careful handwriting his mother had used. It was Thomas who was with Silas on the last night. November of 1891. The hills were burning again, just as they had been on the day Silas crossed the Elk River 35 years earlier. He was 76 years old, thin and white-haired, but still straight-backed, still sharp-eyed. He was sitting in the crystal hall in a walnut chair that Margaret had always said was his best piece of furniture. The lantern light played across the crystals the way it always had, fracturing, multiplying, creating the illusion that the chamber was filled with 1,000 small stars. "Thomas," he said. "Yes, Pa." "Come sit." Thomas sat beside him. He was 36, with his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's quiet manner. He had spent his life in and around the cave, and he loved it with the deep, unquestioning love that comes from growing up inside a wonder and never quite losing the ability to see it. "I want you to keep the records," Silas said. "The temperature logs, the water levels, the formation surveys. Keep them going. Your mother started something important with those records, and it matters that they continue." "I will. And don't sell the large formations. Specimens, yes. The loose ones, the small clusters. But the crystal hall stays as it is. It's not ours to sell. We're just keeping it for a while. I know, Pa. Silas was quiet for a long time. The lantern flame steadied. The crystals held their light. Your Uncle Jonas thought this place was worthless, Silas said at last. He thought I was a fool for taking it, and I suppose by his measure I was. He measured worth in cleared acres and bushels. I measured it differently. He paused. Your mother measured it differently too. She measured it in questions. How deep does it go? What's that mineral? Why does the temperature hold? She always had another question. His voice softened. There's always another question, Thomas. That's the thing about a cave. You think you've reached the end, and there's another passage, another chamber, another crystal you haven't seen before. There's always more to find, Thomas said, quoting words his father had written in the journal decades before. There's always more to find, Silas repeated. He closed his eyes. The cave breathed around them, warm, constant, patient. The same breath it had drawn for 10,000 years. The same breath it would draw for 10,000 more. Silas Cray died 3 days later, on November 19th, 1891, in the southern chamber, where he had slept for 35 years. The temperature in the chamber was 65 degrees. Outside, snow was falling on the hills above the Elk River, whitening the bluff top where Margaret lay beneath her dogwood tree. Inside, the crystals held their ancient light, indifferent and eternal. Thomas recorded the temperature in the journal that morning, as his father would have wanted. He wrote, November 19th, 1891. Southern chamber, 65 degrees, clear and cold above. Pa died at dawn. The cave is warm. Cray's crystal cave remained in the family for 3 more generations. Thomas maintained it as his father had wished, conducting tours, selling specimens, continuing the temperature and water level records that Silas and Margaret had begun in 1856. He married a school teacher from Harlan's Gap in 1893, a quiet woman named Ruth, who shared his love of the hills and the cave, and who bore him 4 children, all of whom grew up with the sound of the underground stream as their lullaby. His children and grandchildren took up the stewardship in turn, and the unbroken record of observations eventually spanned over a century, making it one of the longest continuous environmental data sets in Kentucky's history. The cave itself became a landmark. The Kentucky Geological Survey designated it a site of scientific interest in 1903. Geologists from universities across the country visited to study the crystal formations, the geothermal dynamics, and the cave's unique ecosystem of bats, salamanders, and invertebrates that had adapted to the constant temperature environment. The Celestine deposits, though largely exhausted by the early 20th century, had yielded thousands of specimens that found their way into museum collections from Lexington to London. A particularly fine dogtooth spar formation, extracted by Silas himself in 1864, is still displayed in the Smithsonian's mineral collection, labeled with a card that reads, Calcite, Variety Dogtooth Spar, Cray's Crystal Cave, Harlan County, Kentucky. Collected by S. Cray, 1864. In 1934, a team from the University of Kentucky installed permanent monitoring equipment in the cave, thermometers, hygrometers, water gauges, and began a formal scientific study that would continue for decades. Their findings confirmed what Silas had documented with his mercury thermometer and leather-bound journal. The cave maintained a temperature between 58 and 65 degrees year-round, regulated by the thermal mass of the surrounding limestone and the steady circulation of air through the cave system. The principle was the same one that modern architects would later call earth-sheltered design and passive geothermal heating. the use of the Earth's constant subsurface temperature to maintain comfortable living conditions without mechanical systems or fossil fuels. In the 1970s, during the energy crisis, engineers and architects revisited Silas's journals with renewed interest. Here was a man who had lived comfortably underground for 35 years, through some of the harshest winters in Kentucky's recorded history, using virtually no fuel for heating. His observations about air circulation, thermal stability, and the relationship between cave depth and temperature regulation anticipated by more than a century the principles that would drive the modern geothermal energy industry. A professor from MIT, writing in a 1978 paper on passive heating systems, called Silas's journal a remarkable document of empirical engineering, all the more impressive for having been produced by a man with no formal training who simply paid attention to what the earth was telling him. Silas Cray had not known those terms. He had known only that the earth was warm, that the cave was shelter, and that paying attention, careful, patient, persistent attention, could reveal what fear could not. The dogwood tree above Margaret's grave still blooms each April, its white blossoms bright against the dark Kentucky hillside. The crystal hall still catches the light. Every lantern, every flashlight, every beam of sun that finds its way through the entrance passage is multiplied and refracted until the chamber seems filled with cold white stars. The walnut furniture Silas built still stands in the southern chamber, darkened with age but solid, the joints as tight as the day he made them. And the journal, now housed in the university's special collections, still bears Silas's handwriting on its first page, October 14th, 1856. Have entered the cave. It is not what they said. It never was. The things that frighten us are so rarely what they seem. The dark places we're warned against, the caves, the silences, the separations, sometimes those are the places where the warmth is, where the crystals grow, where a man who was given nothing can build everything. You just have to be willing to go in.